Hi, everybody. A warm welcome to this Caritas Social Action Network conversation on the dignity of labour. 130 years after the publication of Rerum Novarum, the encyclical of Pope Leo XIII on the condition of labour, which inaugurated the modern era of Catholic social teaching. What are the new things for us to consider today in relation to this question? My name is Raymond Friel. I'm the CEO of Caritas Social Action Network, a family of 50 charities serving the most vulnerable and marginalised communities across England and Wales, advocating for a more just and humane society. I'm joined this evening by a distinguished panel and speakers. I'm delighted to welcome as our speakers John Cruddas. John has been MP for Dagenham and Rainham since 2001. And Philip Booth. Philip is the Professor of Finance, Public Policy and Ethics at St Mary's University in Twickenham. On our panel, we have Daisy Serblin. Daisy is the CEO of Million Minutes. Angela Kitching. Angela is the Head of External Affairs at Age UK. And Carol Hattersley. Carol is the Director of Women at the Well. And Lord Maurice Glassman. Maurice is a Labour life peer, academic, founder of Blue Labour and director of the Common Good Foundation. Before we hear from our speakers, we have a pre-recorded message from Archbishop John Wilson, Archbishop of Southwark Diocese.
Dear friends, it's Archbishop John Wilson here, the Archbishop of Southwark. And I'm delighted to offer you a few words of welcome and introduction to this discussion and reflection on the dignity of labour. We're prompted by the 130th anniversary of the encyclical letter of Pope Leo XIII, Rerum Novarum, which addressed crucial questions in his day on the rights and duties of labour and capital. In a sense, Pope Leo XIII, building on the biblical tradition and the tradition of Catholic teaching, laid the foundation for Catholic social tradition which we inherit today. It's been developed by subsequent popes and provides a foundation for how we engage with the world and consider our relationships with each other. At the heart of Catholic social teaching are some key foundational themes: the dignity of the person, the importance of the common good, subsidiarity and solidarity, and in a particular way, narrowing this focus today in our reflections, we look at the rights and duties related to work, wages, property, association, and all of this with a concern for the weakest and the poorest. We have an incredible inheritance through the tradition of Catholic social teaching, and it falls to us in our generation to apply it in our context, to ask the questions about what matters, and to provide answers for the way forward. So welcome to all of you who participate. Thank you to those who will lead and inform our discussion, and may we receive this wonderful inheritance of Catholic social teaching and carry it forward for the good of all into the future.
My thanks to Archbishop John Wilson for those comments and the warm welcome. So we're going to turn to our speakers very soon, and after we hear from them, there'll be a panel discussion, and after that we'll open up the floor to Q&A. So please use the chat function on YouTube. We'll keep an eye on the questions coming in, and we'll put them to either specifically to our guests or generally if it's a general question. So I'd like to hand over first of all to John Cruddas. John, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for this opportunity to say a few words this evening on this wonderful anniversary. Although we might not agree on everything, we could agree on quite a bit, I think, about a notion of the common good concerned with personal and mutual flourishing, treating people as belonging to families, localities and communities, and to shared traditions, interests and faiths, neglected by an exclusively legalistic, managerial or technocratic conception of justice. Now, in industrial society, this interdependency is reflected in the notion of dignity of labour by appealing to an underlying common identity in terms of human dignity. So what do we mean by dignity? Now, we can identify a thin version of dignity from Latin notions of worthiness, yet it also suggests something more significant, something we acknowledge when it is lost. Here, dignity implies a process of reduction, of degradation, of loss of some intrinsic human worth and acceptable moral standards, identifiable across a variety of spiritual, ethical, and human rights traditions. Now, my early catechism insisted that the dignity of the human person is rooted in his or her creation in the image and likeness of God. Call this an essential dignity, and with it, ethical duty to remedy things or processes that violate dignity: genocide, torture, tyranny, exploitation. Our dignity, both our personal dignity and our societal dignity, is shaped by what we tolerate and what we do not. Now, the dignity of labour can also be understood in terms of worthiness and status, that all types of jobs be respected equally, yet within Christian ethics and specifically Catholic teaching, it stretches beyond such a thin usage. A decade before the Labour Party was even created, Rerum Novarum provided an extraordinary condemnation of industrial capitalism and the immiseration of the working class. It asserted the moral imperative to regulate capitalism and a preferential option for the poor in Catholic thought, advocating unions, collective bargaining, and a living wage to maintain and respect the dignity of the person in the workplace, created in the image of God. It urged the capitalist to respect in every man his dignity as a person ennobled of Christian character. 90 years later, in Laborum Exercens, Pope John Paul II elaborated why work is, quote, a fundamental dimension of human existence on earth, and by acting on nature through work, he or she becomes more of a human being. The text asserts the need for work protections to halt the violations of dignity, including against unemployment, wage inequalities, job insecurities, and technological change. Work is a spiritual activity, following the footsteps of a carpenter, through which man collaborates for the redemption of humanity. Now, in terms of the dignity of labour today, in confronting death through pandemic, we recognise the worth of others: care home workers, nurses, porters, orderlies, doctors, drivers, cleaners, public servants, delivery drivers, supermarket employees, many, many more. These jobs are now more visible and have acquired renewed standing. We recognise the dignity of this labour. But as I say, dignity is more than status in a jobs hierarchy. It implies intrinsic human worth and acceptable moral standards in the ways people live and work together. These are questions of justice. Out of pandemic, the dignity of labour could become the organising principle for a new approach to politics, a revived sense of justice, a renewed common good, a new kind of ethical leadership. For example, to reward and support our vocations, our callings, to confront the modern degradation of work across much of the gig economy, those on 0 hours contracts or being fired and rehired, literally today in British Gas. And finally, I just want to make and refract some of what I've said through some of fashionable interest in the idea of a universal basic income. There are strong arguments for and against UBI. On the left, it appeals to utilitarian arguments for maximising the welfare of the maximum number of its citizens. Yet for others, it suggests an oversimplification of economic and social need through a universal monetary figure. It triggers free rider concerns and underplays the significance of contribution in building a just society. Here, citizenship is more than just money transfers. In contrast, liberal supporters suggest UBI expresses a basic human right to a certain level of subsistence, or traced back to Thomas Paine, respects the shared human inheritance of all citizens. For Republicans, it can secure freedom from domination or provide the freedom to help citizens flourish and contribute. And conversely, on the radical right, it's seen as a way to dismantle public services, both labour and social protections, replace the architecture of the welfare state with a personalised money transfer. Other advocates claim political neutrality and suggest it offers it offsets the unequal consequences of automation. So UBI is difficult to assess in terms of competing theories of justice or a simple divide between left and right. But personally, the real problem with UBI debate today is how it is driven by a deterministic, often transhuman assumptions of technological change. Technology is not destiny. If politics matters and could help create good work, purposeful work, rewarding work, then the case for UBI would be less convincing. I believe work to be a fundamental aspect of humanity and a vital source of dignity. There is no evidence that work will end and the robots are taking over. The danger is UBI becomes a "I give up on the dignity of labour" signature idea. The UBI debates reveal profound disagreements about what we value and the dignity of human labour. Even if technological change could wipe out millions of jobs, should we just accept this? There is a strong case, therefore, I would say, against UBI if you believe the end of work thesis to be fundamentally flawed, if you believe the nature of work to be an inherently political question, if you reject a politics over reliance on questions of distribution and utility, and if you recognise the intrinsic value of work in the lives of people, corroborated by mountains of survey evidence. UBI could remain destructive properties. It could rob people of meaning and dignity, leave them isolated, vulnerable, angry and humiliated, and society less fraternal and solidaristic. It could offer the final neoliberal endgame of isolated consumption, with citizens transformed into the ultimate passengers of capitalism. It could be a dystopian nightmare because of the indignities of life without purposeful work. So an embrace of UBI could hinder rather than help forge a renewed sense of justice, the new common good as we emerge out of the pandemic, based around the dignity of labour. Thank you very much.
John, thank you. That was excellent. Thank you for that really stimulating statement. A lot there. I'd love to come straight back, but we're going to be disciplined, and we're going to stick to our schedule. And hand over straight away to Philip. Philip, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raymond, and thank you, John, for those fantastic comments. I'm going to try and deliver this quite quickly so that I can get my teeth into UBI as well. John has now provoked me into doing that. Now, I'm sometimes accused of claiming Catholic social teaching for the case for a small state. Well, it has to be said that if you're looking for lines of Catholic social teaching which favour a big state, Rerum Novarum is not your best starting point. It comes from a tradition of Thomism developed through the late scholastics, which was revived in the late 19th century. It's big on virtue, big on the family and civil society, but pretty small on the state. It is, if you like, in favour of socialization, but not of socialism, a distinction that's been made by other popes. And with this background in mind, I'm going to raise three topics. The first is that of private property. Here, Pope Leo developed and reinforced Thomistic teaching. And if you look at the state of the world today, I think you could say he was prophetic. The word appears in the encyclical on 20 occasions, the word property, and private ownership on another 6 occasions. Private property is linked to the rights of labour. It's something that people have worked for. It's wages in another form, as Pope Leo puts it. The encyclical uses the words inviolable and sacrosanct to describe private property, and he warns very strongly against taxation, while stating that support for the poor, aged, infirm, etc., should be provided by family and networks of mutual organisations that were, of course, common in the UK and indeed throughout Europe at that time. Very importantly, it was pointed out that there is no inconsistency between the social function of property, the universal destination of goods, and private property. Private property is the means by which the other two are actually achieved. And this teaching remained pretty consistent and was reinforced in the celebratory encyclicals in 1931, 1961, and 1991. Why was it prophetic? Well, if we look at the world as a whole, it's very easy for us to take the institution of private property for granted in the West. Leo, though, said, the first and most fundamental principle, therefore, if one would undertake to alleviate the condition of the masses, must be the inviolability of private property. The truth of this statement is demonstrated by looking at those countries today which do and do not define and protect property rights effectively, as well as having court systems to support the institution of property. So here are 5 representative countries from the top 20 in the world for the protection of private property rights: Sweden, Germany, the UK, Holland, and Ireland. And here are 5 from the bottom 20, and they are representative: Albania, Iran, Ethiopia, Bolivia, and Zimbabwe. Charities right across the political spectrum are united in their concern about the fact that 50% of all deforestation takes place as a result of illegal logging. In other words, criminal interests subverting property rights. As Pope Leo, following St. Thomas Aquinas, well understood, private property is necessary for peace, prosperity, and to ensure that people care for the resources that are embedded in the land. There is no doubt that this is true, and that the opposite leads to catastrophe. And literally hundreds of millions, indeed, well over 1 billion people are suffering from the tragedy of living in countries which do not have good institutions to protect the right to property. So that was a really prophetic message, I think, of Pope Leo's. Secondly, Rerum Novarum demands an awful lot of businesses, civil society institutions, rich people, and so on, but doesn't suggest significant state involvement in economic life, except in extreme circumstances. Now, whilst John and I would probably differ about the last bit, I think we can agree on the importance of civil society institutions taking more responsibility for promoting justice in economic life. And I'll come to that at the end in one particular example. The just wage, for example, is an exhortation to employers. There's no suggestion anywhere in Catholic social teaching that the state should determine a statutory minimum wage. The responsibility put on property owners is immense. Pope Leo says, therefore, those whom fortune favours are warned that riches do not bring freedom from sorrow and are of no avail for eternal happiness, but rather are obstacles. And then he says, the rich should tremble at the threatenings of Jesus Christ. The rich might well have their property protected by the institution of private property protected by the state, but if they're not careful, if they're not generous with their property, they might find themselves going to hell. So though Pope Leo is not demanding an extensive role for the state, he's certainly not calling for unbridled markets. And the question is therefore, who should be doing the bridling, and who in particular should look after the rights of labour? Now, virtue and morality are 2 answers to that question, but a third is that of civil society. And another, I might add, is culture, which to some extent binds together all of these things. One of the institutions of civil society which is important here is that of unions. And I would argue, and I think probably John would agree here, that the revival of unions is essential in modern labour markets. In economic terms, they can provide representation in situations where there's inequality of bargaining power. They can provide legal services where there are what economists call information asymmetries. And they can provide welfare services, especially where financial services markets do not work well. Traditionally, trade unions did all of those things, and they did the latter in particular especially well up to the beginning of the 20th century. In Centesimus Annus, John Paul II said, another task of the state is that of overseeing and directing the exercise of human rights in the economic sector. However, primary responsibility in this area belongs not to the state, but to individuals and to the various groups and associations which make up society. Since the role of unions has declined, regulation of labour markets by government of the bureaucratic type that John was referring to has increased hugely. You could argue that such regulation has crowded out unions, or perhaps regulation has filled the vacuum left by the decline of unions. I don't want to assume cause and effect, but I think there is a problem there. However, many of us, of course, lived through the experience of unions in the 1970s when they were vehicles of conflict. But Pope Leo has the answer to this too. Unions should be Catholic, according to Pope Leo, and if not Catholic, which is pretty unlikely in our present situation, they should at least be tolerant of religious viewpoints. They should not be based on class conflict, and they should be vehicles of fraternity. And I would perhaps add, in today's labour market, they should not be industry-based either. So this is where those of us who perhaps believe in a limited state but believe strongly in community and fraternity, have an important meeting point with people like John and Maurice, who have more sympathy with an active state, but also believe in community and fraternity. And I look forward to discussion therefore on what could be some interesting common ground. But I have in fact run out of time, so I can't say anything about the universal basic income, but maybe there'll be an opportunity to do that later.
Philip, thank you again. An excellent statement, very stimulating. I've got a feeling we'll come back to UBI later on. I think that's I had quite a bit of a comment already, but we're going to turn now to the panel. So, panelists, can we see you all? Yeah, I think we can. That's great. Daisy, can I turn to you first? I'd be interested to get your perspective on all of this from the point of view of young people and the economic situation that we're living through. And I'm particularly struck, I mean, Philip mentioned private property there, and because one of the things, and I know this from my own experience as the father of 3 boys in their 20s, that private property is something that seems increasingly sort of out of reach of young people. Do you want to offer some comments on that, please?
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Raymond, and I'm very grateful to be here tonight on this very illustrious panel where I'm learning a lot. Yeah, I actually made a note to mention the private property thing because, you know, if you're a young person today, good luck. Try to own your own property anytime soon, unless you've got significant family wealth behind you to cover the deposit. So yeah, that's an interesting one, and I think that's one of the main ways in which this generation is really different to its parents. Actually, I'm going to sidestep some of the complicated debates around universal basic income and regulation, and just apply some of these ideas to the reality of young people's situations today. Because actually, I think that's what we really need to do in order to keep Catholic social teaching, and hopefully the church as well, relevant, especially to young people. I don't think anyone here can properly fathom the lifelong impact that the pandemic has had and will continue to have on young people who have lived and grown up and had their formative years in a time of unprecedented global economic instability. And we already know from statistics that from across the board that young people are some of the worst impacted economically. And that's something we all have to deal with, whatever our economic and political ideology. This lockdown generation has lost countless months in education, an immeasurable amount in job prospects, lifetime earnings, confidence, health, and so much more. 18 to 24-year-olds are the most likely age group to have lost a job or received a wage cut as a result of the pandemic. Almost 2/3 of all people who lost their jobs in the UK pandemic are under 25. ONS stats show us that of all the 16 to 24-year-olds who are currently unemployed, 3/4 of them have been unemployed for at least 6 months. And across the UK, youth unemployment is on the up, reaching almost 1 in 5 in parts of London and other cities. And we all know what happens when we've got long-term unemployment, especially of young people. So even before we take into account the crippling effects of the gig economy and other things that John had mentioned, and the changing nature of the labour market, long-term unemployment is already hitting our young people. And I just wanted to make a really quick note on some intersections as well, which I think are important, and I suppose were not mentioned in the original Rerum Novarum, understandably, because it was a document of its time. Race matters in this discussion. Young Black people and Black graduates are almost 3 times as likely to be unemployed as their white peers during the coronavirus pandemic. And young people of colour in general are twice as likely to be unemployed. And gender matters too. Women under 25 are particularly hard hit, since they're more likely to work in areas affected by the pandemic, including retail, hospitality, travel, tourism. And that's before we even take into account unpaid labour and unpaid care. So for me, I really want to see this really important Catholic social teaching value of the dignity of labour being applied to a modern situation, and specifically the situation that young people are facing. And I think the 21st century church will be very much judged on the ways in which it responds to the younger generations facing unprecedented difficulties. Pope Francis has called on the church to be a field hospital tending to the wounded. And we really need that today. Young people in particular need this emergency response from our church and from society to have a relevant offer to those who are facing an unprecedented and unfathomable economic reality. Thank you.
Daisy, thank you so much. A lot to come back on there, but before we open it up, I want to just go to the rest of the panel members, and then we'll come back and see what we want to develop a little bit further. Angela, if I could turn to you next, it might make sense, if you like, to look at the other end of the life course, if you like, to older people who, increasingly are facing insecure ends of life, longer working lives, pension insecurity, insecurity about care, and so on. Would you like to offer a perspective from your work, please?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been an interesting set of views so far, and often older people are pitched against younger people in some of these debates. I'd just like to make the case for that being a completely false distinction. It's certainly this pandemic's impact has been a U-shaped impact. So after the 18 to 24s, the fastest age group to lose their jobs in this pandemic have been workers aged 50 to 69. We've had the fastest fall out of employment amongst older workers since the 1980s. And after 6 months, 2/3 of those people will not have found employment. Younger people tend to find employment more quickly, although their employment is less secure. When older workers do find employment, having re-entered the jobs market, they tend to have taken a very significant wage cut, and their wages don't recover over their working lifetime in the way that sometimes younger people's wages do. I don't think that the young versus old debate is the right frame to see it in, because, I mean, the risk is that if we don't recognise the impacts that there have been on poorer people right across the age spectrum, then we won't really manage to rebuild a society that is fair to people. I think that as Daisy said, we've got to bear in mind the impacts of race, of gender, and of poverty on communities, because otherwise people turn increasingly, especially in older age, they have to fall back on the state for their income for longer. And obviously, if you are out of work at 50 and you're unable to return to work or are forced into a caring role too early, you then potentially have another 30 to 40 years worth of life in which you have to rely on the state for your income. So it's in all of our interests to try and make sure that people are enabled to work in dignified and appropriate work in older age to allow them to support themselves and to support their transition either into a caring role or into retirement. Pope Francis recently talked about the poisonous culture of waste if we don't recognise the value of older workers and of older people as contributors to society. And Rerum Novarum is silent on the issue of retirement and the appropriate time to leave work. That's obviously a challenge for our age, but we really need to make sure that we remember that people need to have a workplace that's appropriate to their needs, as more of us frankly need to stay in work for longer to support ourselves and our families, or need the kind of work that allows us to balance caring responsibilities. I'm half of a job share. There's an example of the way in which the workplace needs to change in order to better support people's needs to work and to provide family care at the same time. And that's the kind of changes that I hope that we might manage to see, because as more people work from home, as we've seen lots of us contributing from home tonight, as more people are able to work hopefully more flexibly in a workplace that is more digitally enabled, then hopefully we will manage to develop jobs that better respect the balance that people need in their lives to maintain their dignity between family life and the workplace. So those are some of the kind of more positive potentials that the workplace could grasp if we do manage to make the changes that are needed. But we've just got to remember that really people of all ages, we need to bear in mind the working poor whose jobs have been made significantly, are often less flexible in the way they can be delivered and have been made significantly more vulnerable throughout this pandemic. And a particular mention, as John gave, to care workers who, unlike the NHS workers, often are on very, very low incomes, are having to provide a very high degree of skilled care and are on very unstable wages. We desperately need a reform that allows people to have dignity in that workplace. We've seen during the pandemic massive, heroic, literally life-giving efforts by care workers. Nearly 1,000 care workers have died in care homes as a result of their work during the pandemic, and over 30,000 older people have died in care homes during this time. If we're going to reset this, we have to focus on the needs of some of those people who really need dignity and security in their workplace.
Thank you, Angela. Yeah, very powerful comments. I'll move on to Carol next. I mean, Angela mentioned there, Carol, that, you know, Rerum Novarum is of its time. I mean, it's ahead of its time in many ways, but it's also of its time and in a context. And it didn't say much about retirement or older working. It does talk about women, but again, very much of its age. It imagines women very much as being in the home and homemakers and so on, which is a context which has changed somewhat since 1891. Do you want to offer some comments from that perspective in terms of what you're doing, your advocacy?
Yeah, I mean, I think I might be echoing some of what Daisy and Angela have said. I think the issues are common across lots of communities and groups, and I think for me the most important thing that I'm trying to hold on to here is that the issues that we're facing and the challenges we're facing are not because of the pandemic. They have merely been highlighted by the pandemic. These are perennial, long-term issues that we've seen over many years around gender, age, disability, race, etc., etc. So I mean, for me, you know, we know that women are especially vulnerable to being exploited within the labour market. And again, the pandemic showed us through particularly things like the lack of access to personal protective equipment early on for those in care work, who are, again, a predominantly women-centred, female-centred profession. You know, women have traditionally dominated work that has a perceived low value, you know, care, and we've talked about all this. And as much as we all clapped on a Thursday night, I don't think we've really raised the status of those jobs at all. And you know, that yes, they're more visible on social media, but I don't think the status of those jobs has been raised, and it won't be until they're remunerated fairly for the effort they put in and the hours they put in and the overtime that they put in that is unpaid. We saw the gig economy putting women at increased risk of reduced personal security in work, many unable to access any government support programs through, I can't remember what it was called, the furlough system, there we go. You know, we see women at increased risk of unemployment, denied access to a just and fair wage. And women also, and this was highlighted during the pandemic, women also bear the burden of responsibility for homes and upbringing of their children in comparison to their male partners. And taken together, this puts women in absolutely impossible positions, making choices to survive, and that might be staying in an abusive relationship with an abusive partner, or that might be, as we see in our work, finding themselves in situations where they're coerced and exploited into prostitution as a means to feed their family. And we are seeing more and more women now coming onto the streets, making those survival choices, and it's devastating to watch, I have to say. And as both Daisy and Angela have mentioned, you know, the challenges faced by women are exacerbated by chronic intersections of race, age, disability, you know, that's a long list. And as you mentioned, Raymond, you know, the bulk of Catholic social thought and teaching in this area still either ignores women or still holds on to this out-of-date gendered kind of perception of women's role within the labour market in terms of things like the Catholic worker rhetoric and things. And that's a real challenge for us, I think, in the church going forward, and how we build forward to make this a fairer, and, you know, not to build, I don't think we need to build back better, I think we need to build back different, you know, just make those changes.
Carol, thank you. I'm sure there's a lot there what we want to come back to, but I want to go now to Maurice. Maurice, would you like to just offer any comments, what you heard from Philip or John, or just pick up any of the points you've heard so far this evening?
Yeah, certainly, and really thank you, Raymond, for the invitation. It's a huge celebration for me this day. I mean, so I just want to really really express my gratitude to the church and to Catholic social teaching, but it changed my life, because it gave me something that I couldn't find either within my own tradition, which is the Jewish tradition, or the secular socialist tradition. I mean, this new thing was a critique of capitalism, of capital, of this new, what is this new thing? And Philip, it precisely what it gave me was a concept of solidarity and the dignity of labour that didn't resort to an administrative centralised state as the principal mechanism for its enforcement. But it did say that these new conditions create something, and I read it every year, you know, it's ever ancient, ever new for me, but it says a condition akin to slavery. You know, that's what's going on. That's the scale. I mean, in some ways, it's a miracle that it happened. I mean, it's important to say for us, you know, about Cardinal Manning, is that he was, that a lot of this came from England. It was a kind of English-German operation with Archbishop Kettler in Germany. And what he understood was that this new thing was the domination, and this is, you know, it's 8:30, so 6:30, so I apologize for using this word so early in the day, but it introduces this concept of commodification, the turning of human beings and their natural environment into commodities. And Caro, that's how I'm receiving what you're saying. I mean, what is prostitution other than the commodification of love, of the commodification of sex? And so it remains. I just wanted to express that thanks. And then, as John and Philip mentioned, you know, this concept of a common good, that there could be a reconciliation of interests. So in relation to what Daisy and Angela were saying, I'm completely with you, Angela, that I'm often taken aback by a visceral loathing of old people, that this is very alien to the tradition, while Daisy, I completely hear. So how do we think creatively about this? And I think that what John's talking about with the dignity of labour provides a key. There's huge issues. I mean, there's huge reality, let's say, of loneliness and isolation of old people. This is something that I think that we have to live with and dwell on and look to remedy. So in terms of vocation and this concept of vocation that's so central to Rerum Novarum, how do we build a system of vocational training that brings old and young people into relationships in relation to the dignity of labour? This is to cut off that's the whole thing as far as I'm concerned, is how do we overcome these silos and bring people into relationship? Very difficult in COVID, because there's another religious concept that is really vital, which is real physical presence. And how do you bring them into real relationship? That's the key. So I'm just, you know, suggesting that one of the central things that maybe we could work on together is a vocational system in which old people are brought into relation to young people in terms of the passing on of skills, the passing on of expertise. That this is, I don't know what you think, Angela and Daisy, but that's where it's ever ancient, ever new in that way. And it's also to say that in its move from what was essentially a feudal political economy to this modern political economy, which is what Rerum Novarum represents, what do you do with the concentrations of wealth and the pressure exerted to commodify your Well, he says that through association, you know, that's the thing that Philip rightly mentioned in relation to trade unions. But he was also working within concepts which Philip alluded to, of skills, of guilds, of all different forms of solidarity that can resist the dehumanization of the person. And I think that that's what Rerum Novarum is about. How do you resist the relentless pressure to isolation, dehumanization, and commodification through, you know, let's say the words that it used, through love, solidarity, and democracy? You know, those are the ways. And certainly it's fantastic to listen to John renew this tradition for our time. So those are, so everything that we get at the moment is a question of polarization: cities versus small towns, young versus old, north versus south. The hope that the Catholic social thought gives me is that you don't resolve that by ignoring those distinctions, but you actively negotiate a human settlement based on precisely the principles that it outlines, which are four, which is what John talked about, which is the status of the human being as a non-commodity. That's the first thing, that they're a human being. It's beautifully put in Rerum Novarum, and John Paul II developed it in Centesimus Annus and in Laborum Exercens, capable of evil but with a tendency to love. It's a brilliant concept of the person, that we are capable of wrong, but the tendency is, as Philip said, the Aristotelian thing and the Thomist thing, that we are social beings by our nature, with a tendency to attachment, relationship, and to work, labor. And just to say that that's very rich, I think, in relationship to what you're talking about with the gender issue, because labor is both giving birth, the act of labor, the reproduction, and the reproduction of our world through labor, that those two are intrinsically linked and conceptualized as a calling and as a vocation. So the first thing is the status and the dignity of labor. The second thing is this subsidiarity, that this needs to be sorted out with real physical presence in local places at the most local level possible. So the solution to this is not precisely through ever bigger state programs, but ever greater community participation and engagement. The third one is solidarity, which is vital, but that there must be this relationship between the rich and the poor, and within a community, must be based on mutual responsibility one to the other. As well as, very interestingly, when Pope Leo XIII is talking about private property, he's also talking about self-governing corporations, such as the church, such as the unions, the integrity of those institutions as having liberty. And the fourth one, which was way ahead of its time, was the stewardship of nature, because it's not just human beings that are commodified, it's creation itself. This is the thing that blew my mind with Rerum Novarum. He was saying, this is something new, that human beings and nature, i.e. creation, can become subject to fluctuating market prices in all its forms. And Caro, I just see you as faithful witness to the process of that, as it goes right down to the very basis of life. So I could go on. It's wonderful to be here, but I just really want to just express gratitude, because it never fails to renew reflection on what really matters, which is how do we take care of each other in a world where there are, in Laborum Exercens and in Centesimus Annus, John Paul II calls it a structure of sin going on within capitalism. And I think that structure of sin is the incentive to vice, to maximize continually the highest returns at the quickest speed, which just turns us all into accessories to a market. But how do we do that without an authoritarian state? That remains the fundamental question. And just to say again to Angela and to Daisy, I'd love to engage on how we, through the concept of vocation, bring into relationship a participative community with young and old. I'm sorry for talking so long, but it's good to be here.
Please don't apologise, Maurice. That was wonderful. What an inspiring set of statements and contributions. Please don't forget, if you're watching on YouTube, to post your questions. There's one or two coming in. I want to just go back to just John and Philip, and just give John and Philip a chance to come back at anything they've heard or develop any points. John, first of all, anything you want to come back on or develop a bit further?
Well, this debate could go on for literally hours. I agree with everything that was said in the four sort of comments, but I'll just make a couple of things. And it seems to me my constituency was right in the middle of what they call the COVID triangle. where the second wave exploded, and we had the highest rates in the country, partly because of the work people do, because they were not sitting at home on Zoom calls. They were out and about all the time, caring for one another, frontline services, serving shops, driving, construction work, etc. And upon that, we have to acknowledge that these are often people who would described as part of the left behind, you know, in these terrible terms of modern politics. And the thing for me is whether this experience of pandemic, literally confronting death and relying on the callings of others to help us, whether that can allow us to rethink the character of the country going forward. Build back different is exactly right, I think Gareth said. And to me, it's because if you look around the world, a few years ago, we said that liberal market capitalism had ended history. Now history is being upended because modern capitalism is failing to deliver in terms of the quality of worker it's producing. It is a crisis of work. And so maybe the effects of the pandemic can civilize capitalism again, whilst also reprioritize what we value. And the one thing that I always think is about the importance of care that we all talked about. Why is it that the work around care is the least rewarded in society? What does that tell us about what we prioritize in society itself compared to, say, high finance or whatever? It shines a light on us, on what we tolerate and the indignities that we allow to fester. So it's such a rich conversation. I could go on for hours. I just think the question of human dignity could become an organizing principle for how we build back differently. Not just around labour, but all sorts of wider questions of fraternity and respect and contribution and reward across society. So that's why it's not just about the dignity of labour, but it's a good way, it's a good gateway into wider questions of justice itself. So thank you very much indeed for inviting me. It's a really rich conversation that we could go on for days, actually. But they're my just initial responses to what's been said.
Yeah. I agree, John. We could be here all night. It was great, but I've got an eye on the clock, sadly. Philip, do you want to come back on anything you've heard?
Okay. I mean, just three things, two of them incredibly brief. One is that there have been two mentions of the status and value of people in relation to their pay. You know, it is impossible to have a situation whereby people's pay reflect somehow some subjective valuation of the worth of that job in society. There'll be total chaos. I should say my wife works as a co-worker, by the way. Markets just wouldn't function at all. You'd have shortages in some occupations and too many people wanting to do other occupations. We have to find a way culturally, to respond to what Cara said, of valuing people whose work is really important, but not necessarily well paid. We have to turn that question, I think, round the other way. Secondly, I think there's a direct analogy between everything that both Pope Pius XI and Leo XIII said about the capital labor conflict, and that's not descending into class conflict between class-based unions and capital, and our discussions about race. It's vital that they don't descend into conflicts relating to identity, and that we treat people as individuals and don't discriminate against people on the basis of any of the characteristics they have. But you know, the kind of blaming everything on colonialism on the one hand, and then on the other hand, trying to set one race against another. It's just vital that we just don't do that. And I see the overtones of that in quite a lot of the debates we have about race. Thirdly, on the question of universal basic income, I just, whatever the problem is, this is just not the answer for all the reasons that John gave and a few more, and that Maurice hinted at. Firstly, there is a huge cost to the state if the state is the provider of income of first resort. But secondly, the whole point of families, or sorry, not the whole point of families, but one of the points of families is to share resources. The idea that somebody within a family who doesn't work should receive an income simply by virtue of their existence when they're living within a family which is otherwise quite well off, it is really inimical to Catholic social teaching. Thirdly, the idea that you should receive an income even if you don't contribute anything to the community, unless there's a particular reason why you should do so, because you can't, by virtue of some misfortune, contribute anything to the community, is also contrary to everything that's laid out in Catholic social teaching. And finally, work involves socialization, and this is a really important aspect of work. And the idea, again, that you should receive an income from just sitting there on your own, not socializing or fraternizing with anybody, I think is just totally wrong. And it just comes out of nowhere as an idea. There's nowhere in the Old Testament, the New Testament, the patristics, the early church, any St. Thomas, the late scholastics, or any part of Catholic social teaching from which you can derive a universal basic income. It's just a concept which is, well, it's an orphan concept. It doesn't have any mother or father at all. And whatever the social problem, there is a better answer to it than a universal basic income.
Thank you, Philip. That's an interesting one. I'm sure that will roll on and on. I know some people are really gearing up to advocate for UBI, and the Pope's very interested in it. So we'll come back to that. But again, I'm conscious of time, and I just want to try and pick up some of the questions coming in. And one of the questions coming in is, well, what can we do now to advance the dignity of those in work? You know, yes, we can talk about what we shouldn't do. But what can we do now, practically to begin to improve, assuming that there is a problem, that there is a lack of dignity? As John said, dignity is sometimes best defined by its absence. We kind of know when it's not there. How can we begin to advance the dignity of working conditions now? Does anyone on the panel want to come in with a comment on that?
Yeah, maybe I can.
Angela, do you want to come in?
Yeah, if that's okay. Thank you, Roman. I think just partly to respond to that question and partly to reflect on the challenge that Morris set for how do we make sure that people are actually brought together and not split apart in a work context at the moment. Pope Francis suggests that old age is a time of gift and dialogue, that you should be able to pass on skills and that you should be able to reflect on the mistakes that you've made in your own life and talk to other people about them. So those are and I think that idea of relationship between young and old is absolutely key. That's the only proven scientific way we have of breaking down stereotypes, is to bring people into true relationship with each other. And I'd say that there are two things in the world of work that might practically help with that. One is making workplaces places that are not only geared to people who can be there full-time in one place, in full presence all the time, regardless of their other family responsibilities. That is absolutely key to the change that we need to see. It will allow carers to remain in the workplace. It will allow women with children to remain in the workplace. It will allow people with health conditions or disabilities to engage in the workplace. Those things are key. So that's really practical. We can do it straight away. We have been doing it in many, many circumstances over the last year. So we've proven we can do it. We should just take that and run with it. But I think that second question of around, and we've had a little debate around social care. Panels should disagree with each other, and I'm going to disagree with Philip about the value of work and pay. Not because we should pay all care workers the same as we pay bankers because we value their moral contributions that much, but because, and Reverend Navarro touches on this quite strongly, we should be in a position where people are able to put a roof over their head, they're able to bring up a family, and they're able to feed themselves and that family. And it's a key theme that we need to have people who are in work at least well remunerated enough to be able to sustain basic dignity in their families. And that's what I think we need to link work, value and pay together to at least make sure that people who are working full time, who are contributing enormously, are able to sustain basic dignity. And that's where I think that's a change that I think we should set ourselves as a moral challenge to respond to the question that's come in. We should really set as a priority. How do we make sure that work pays adequately enough to allow people to have their proper place in their families and in their societies and to be in right relationship with each other? And that's particularly key when it's younger workers working with older people in a setting of social care. I would say that's where there's plenty of evidence that it breaks down enormously at the moment.
Thank you, Angela. Just as we go into the last few minutes, does anyone want to come back on that, or just
Can I just add one thing
John,
on that,
please?
Rowan?
Yeah,
I'll just say there is an example just across the pond who's someone who is establishing his whole public policy agenda around the dignity of work, and that's Joe Biden. And he's talked about creating 18 million jobs, quote, jobs you can raise a family on, which ties exactly what Angela was saying. And he's putting Catholic social teaching as an anchor to his administration. So maybe there's a work in progress that we should keep our eye on in terms of the practical policy rollout based around the catechism. Thank you.
Right. Anyone else want to come in on that? Dignity now, practical. There's comments coming in, Carol, very much touched by your comments about women in the workplace. Do you want to kind of develop any of your points about what we can practically do in that area?
I don't have a solution. If I did, I wouldn't be here. I'd be earning money somewhere else. But I genuinely, I think, I mean, we need to really, I mean, I would disagree with Philip as well. I think, you know, when we're talking about, you know, remuneration, we're also talking about remuneration for emotional labour and not just the act of physically being somewhere and doing something. And it is not okay that a care worker could earn more on a checkout at Lidl. Nothing wrong with Lidl, nothing wrong with a checkout at Lidl, but it is not okay. I think for me, you know, the bottom line on this is that, you know, the marketplace is what distorts our values in this. And so actually that's where we have to look at what we're doing. It cannot be okay that the man who runs Amazon doubled his fortune during the pandemic by moving cardboard boxes around when there are people sleeping in cardboard boxes, still sleeping in cardboard boxes. And someone else said that to me a few weeks ago, and it had a profound effect on me. You know, we need sufficiency, we need security, we need status for everybody within the workplace and within labour. And, you know, I just wish we could put value on the emotional labour as well as on the productive labour that is seen as more valuable. And that would make a huge difference across all the intersections, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Carl. I think the questions what we value and how we value it are really important. Daisy, did you want to come back in?
It was just to, yeah, I mean, you know, I very much agree with much of what has been said, especially Angela and Caro. I guess I always worry that there is an undertone, not to this discussion, but to discussions about our future as a country and our economy, that young people will be okay because they're always okay, and we're okay, and we were young people once. And I'm constantly reminded of the fact that this is an unprecedented pandemic, and I worry that we're going to fall into a dangerous trap if we just assume that young people are always bounce back. And I just wanted to take issue with, sorry, Philip, I just wanted to take issue with the point that Philip made about identity politics, because actually, for me, those intersections of race and gender and class are actually the most important thing. And, you know, we've all touched on the ways in which your experience of labour and the experience of the dignity of labour or the indignity of labour is shaped by those identities. Actually, those identities are really important in this discussion. So I just wanted to finish saying that.
Thank you, Daisy. Philip, did you want to come back in either Angela or Daisy's points at all?
I think Angela and Caro, I think Daisy and I just disagree. We probably need a much longer period to unpick this, but I just don't believe that the right approach to these problems is based on class conflict. It has to be based upon or setting groups against each other. But I think Angela and Caro, to some extent, you're putting up a straw man. I wasn't saying that care workers shouldn't be paid a dignified wage. I was simply saying that, you know, we can't simply set wages by how much we judge subjectively people's value within society. And if you did that, there would be chaos. You'd have shortages in some areas of the economy, surpluses in other areas of the economy. I mean, my wife moved from teaching to being a care worker. It took her, 6 years to train as a teacher and a month to train as a care worker. If she'd got paid as much as a care worker as a teacher, she may never have become a teacher in the first place, and many other people might have taken the same decision. And so markets have to play some considerable role in paying, in determining pay, and then we have to find a dignified way of ensuring that where we believe for one reason or another that markets don't reflect what people should be earning, whether that's in terms of their individual position in society or the income of their family, of topping up those incomes to ensure that they can have a dignified living. And there's lots of debate to have as to what the best way is to do that.
Philip, thank you so much. This feels like the wrong thing to do, but I'm going to have to draw it to an end. It feels as if we're just beginning. Thank you so much to our speakers, our panelists, for a very, very rich and stimulating discussion. I'm hoping that we'll be back in the autumn. We're very much interested in having a series of these Caritas conversations and bringing in lots more people, continuing this really rich, interesting, and vitally important topic. So thanks everyone for joining us either on YouTube or our speakers and panelists. Sadly, we'll have to leave it there, but hopefully we'll meet again before too long. In the meantime, good night, take care, and we'll see you all soon.